idea of a water path across Central America between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans is very old. In 1513, a Spanish explorer named Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the narrow land in Panama. He became the first European to see the Pacific Ocean from the Americas. This showed the land connection was possible. Soon after, in 1534, the Spanish King Charles V ordered a study. He wanted to see if a canal could be built in Panama. The study found it was too difficult with the tools and knowledge available then. For the next 300 years, the idea mostly stayed an idea. Building a canal was too big and hard. Spain did not try seriously again. The land belonged to Spain until the early 1800s. Then the countries of Central America became independent. Interest in a canal grew again later in the 1800s. One big reason was the California gold rush starting in 1848. Many people from the east coast of the United States wanted to go to California quickly. Going by ship around South America took a very long time and was dangerous. A shorter route was needed. This led to the building of the Panama Railroad. Work started in 1850 and finished in 1855. It crossed the same narrow land in Panama. The railroad was very successful. It showed that crossing Panama was possible. It also made money by moving people and goods. The railroad proved that a major transportation link in Panama could work. It made people think a canal might also be possible. Around the same time, the United States and Great Britain signed an agreement in 1850. It was called the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. This agreement said that if a canal was ever built in Central America, both countries would protect it. Neither country would control it alone. It would be neutral, meaning open to ships from all countries. The treaty did not say where the canal should be. It just said if one was built. People argued about the best place for a canal. Panama was one possibility. Another possibility was Nicaragua. Nicaragua had big lakes that might be used as part of a canal route. It seemed easier. Teams of engineers were sent to look at both places. They studied the land, the rivers, the rocks, and the weather. They tried to figure out where it would be easier and cheaper to dig a canal. They measured distances and heights. They looked at how much dirt and rock would need to be moved. They also thought about sickness in the hot, wet climate. These early surveys in Panama and Nicaragua were important. They collected basic information about the land. They showed that building a canal would be a huge job. It would cost a lot of money. It would need new machines and ways of working. It would also be very dangerous for workers because of diseases like malaria and yellow fever, which were common in the area. No one knew how to stop these diseases then. The idea of a canal was becoming more serious. The success of the Panama Railroad showed the value of a fast route. The political agreement between the U.S. and Britain removed one obstacle. The surveys gave some facts about the two main options, Panama and Nicaragua. But no one was ready to actually start building. It still seemed too big, too expensive, and too difficult. More studies were needed. Someone with a lot of money and confidence would need to take the risk. The dream of a canal across the Americas remained just a dream for a while longer. The land waited. The idea of building a canal through Panama gained serious attention in the late 19th century. After the success of the Suez Canal in Egypt, completed in 1869, Many believed a similar project could connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Ferdinand de Lesseps, the French diplomat who led the Suez Project, became the main promoter of the Panama Canal idea. In 1879, an international congress met in Paris to discuss the canal project. De Lesseps pushed strongly for a sea-level canal, one without locks, through Panama, despite some engineers suggesting a lock system would be better. The Congress approved his plan, and the Compagnie Universelle du Canal Interocéanique was created to build it. Work began in 1881 with great enthusiasm. The French brought modern equipment for that time: steam shovels, dredges, and railway systems to move dirt. However, they quickly encountered problems no one had fully anticipated. The tropical environment proved much harsher than in Egypt. Heavy rains caused constant landslides in the excavated areas, sometimes undoing months of work in minutes. The most serious challenge was disease. Malaria and yellow fever spread rapidly among workers. At first, no one understood these illnesses came from mosquitoes. Workers died in large numbers, sometimes hundreds in a single month. The French tried bringing in new workers from Europe and the Caribbean, but the death rate remained shockingly high. Engineering problems also mounted. The Culebra Cut, now called Gaillard Cut, where the canal needed to go through mountains, proved especially difficult. The rock was harder than expected, and landslides kept filling in the dugout areas. The French plan for a sea-level canal required removing much more material than originally calculated. Financial troubles began in 1885. The project was costing much more than planned, and progress was far slower than expected. De Lesseps kept asking investors for more money, claiming success was near. But by 1887, it became clear the sea-level plan wouldn't work. The company switched to a lock-based design, but it was too late. In 1889, the company ran out of money completely and went bankrupt. The project collapsed amid accusations of poor management and financial wrongdoing. About 20,000 workers had died during the French effort, mostly from disease. The company had spent nearly 1.5 billion francs, about $287 million then, but only completed about 40% of the excavation. The failure became a huge scandal in France known as the Panama Affair. De Lesseps and others were put on trial for fraud and mismanagement. The scandal hurt France's reputation and made investors wary of big international projects. However, the French effort wasn't completely wasted. They had built some infrastructure, completed important surveys, and excavated significant portions of the route. This work would later help the Americans when they took over the project. The French also left behind equipment and buildings that could be reused. The failed attempt taught important lessons. A sea-level canal wasn't practical in Panama. Disease control was absolutely necessary. Better organization and planning were needed. The project required much more money than originally thought. After the bankruptcy, a new French company took over the assets, but didn't continue construction. They mainly tried to keep the project alive long enough to sell it to another country. By the late 1890s, the United States became interested in taking over the canal project, seeing its potential for military and commercial use. The French period showed how difficult building the Panama Canal would be, but also proved it might be possible with better planning, more money, and solutions to the disease problems. The failed attempt scared away many investors, but paved the way for eventual success under American leadership. After the French failure, the canal project seemed dead. The French company kept its rights, but did no more work. For 10 years, nothing happened. Then, in the 1890s, the United States began looking seriously at building a canal. Two routes were possible, through Panama or through Nicaragua. A U.S. commission studied both places in 1899 to 1901. Panama had advantages. It was shorter, and the French had already done some work there. But Nicaragua had large lakes that could be part of the canal. The commission first favored Nicaragua. Then something changed their minds. Philippe Bunau-Varilla, a French engineer from the old canal company, worked hard to convince the Americans to choose Panama. He gave them information showing Nicaragua had volcanoes that could be dangerous. He also said Panama would be cheaper because of the French work already done there. In 1902, the U.S. Congress voted for Panama. The next problem was getting permission. Panama was then part of Colombia. The U.S. offered Colombia $10 million plus $250,000 yearly to allow the canal. In 1903, both countries signed the Hay-Heron Treaty, but Colombia's government refused to approve it. They wanted more money. This made Bunau-Varilla and some Panamanians angry. They saw the canal as good for Panama. With quiet support from the U.S. government, they planned to make Panama independent from Colombia. On November 3, 1903, the revolution happened. U.S. warships stopped Colombian troops from reaching Panama. Panama became independent in just 3 days with almost no fighting. The new Panama government quickly made a deal with the U.S. Bunau-Varilla, now representing Panama, signed the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty on November 18, 1903. This treaty gave the U.S. control of a 10-mile-wide canal zone forever, the right to build and run the canal, the right to protect the canal with military force. In return, Panama got $10 million and $250,000 per year. Many Panamanians later felt this treaty was unfair. The U.S. got much more than they had offered Colombia, but at the time, the new government accepted it. They needed U.S. support and wanted the canal built. With the treaty signed, the U.S. could now start work. They bought the French company's equipment and land for $40 million. This included the unfinished canal, buildings, railroads, and tools. The total cost so far was high, but less than starting from nothing. The U.S. government created the Isthmian Canal Commission to manage the project. They needed to decide how to build the canal. The French sea level plan had failed. Now engineers favored a lock canal, using dams to create lakes and locks to raise and lower ships. This would require less digging than cutting all the way through at sea level. Before construction could start, two big problems needed solving. Disease, malaria and yellow fever, still killed many people. Organization, the French effort had been poorly managed. The U.S. appointed John Findlay Wallace as the first chief engineer in 1904. But he faced many difficulties. The work sites were disorganized. Equipment from France was old or broken. Worker housing was inadequate. Worst of all, disease continued to kill many workers. After 1 year, little progress had been made. Many Americans began to doubt the project could succeed. Something needed to change. In 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt appointed a new chief engineer, John Stevens, and a new doctor, William Gorgas. These two men would transform the canal project. The events of 1903 were crucial. The quick revolution, the new treaty, and the U.S. takeover set the stage for successful construction. But major challenges remained. The next years would show whether the Americans could succeed where the French had failed. They needed to solve the disease problem, organize the massive project, and actually build the canal, all in one of the most difficult work environments in the world. The American effort to build the Panama Canal began slowly in 1904. The first year showed little progress as the new team faced the same problems that defeated the French. Workers continued dying from disease, equipment broke down frequently, and the tropical environment made work extremely difficult. The initial approach of continuing where the French left off proved unsuccessful. John Stevens became the new chief engineer in 1905 and changed everything. He understood that before any real construction could begin, the basic problems needed solving. The first priority was controlling the diseases that killed so many workers. Dr. William Gorgas received full support to implement his mosquito control program. Workers drained swamps where mosquitoes bred, sprayed oil on standing water, and installed screens in living quarters. These simple measures virtually eliminated yellow fever within a year and greatly reduced malaria cases. At the same time, Stevens improved living conditions for the workforce. He built proper housing with screened windows, established clean water systems, and created hospitals with trained medical staff. Cafeterias served tens of thousands of meals daily. These changes made Panama a safer place to work and attracted more laborers to the project. The workforce grew from a few thousand to over 30,000 at the project's peak. Stevens also made the crucial decision to abandon the French sea-level canal plan. Instead, he proposed using a system of locks and creating a large artificial lake. This required building a massive dam across the Chagres River to form Gatun Lake, which would serve as the canal's main waterway. Ships would be raised and lowered through 3 sets of locks at each end of the canal. This design significantly reduced the amount of excavation needed compared to the French approach. Actual construction began in earnest after these preparations. The work divided into several major components. Building the Gatun Dam required moving enormous amounts of earth and rock. The dam created what was then the world's largest artificial lake. Workers constructed the locks using concrete poured on site. The locks used a system of gates and chambers to raise and lower ships between sea level and the lake level. The most challenging section was the Culebra Cut, later renamed Gaillard Cut. This 8-mile stretch required digging through the Continental Divide. Workers used steam shovels and dynamite to remove rock and soil, which trains then carried away. The sides of the cut kept sliding down, requiring constant re-excavation. Engineers eventually solved this by making the slopes less steep. The project became highly organized under Stevens's leadership. Trains moved materials precisely where needed. Workshops repaired equipment around the clock. A telegraph system coordinated work across the entire canal zone. When Stevens unexpectedly resigned in 1907, President Roosevelt appointed Army engineer George Goethals to complete the project. Goethals maintained the efficient systems Stevens had established. By 1913, all major components were complete. The locks had been tested, Gatun Lake filled with water, and the Culebra Cut finally stabilized. On October 10, 1913, President Woodrow Wilson triggered the explosion that removed the last barrier between the oceans. The first official ship passed through the completed canal on August 15, 1914, just as World War I began in Europe. The American effort took 10 years and cost $375 million. About 5,600 workers died during construction, far fewer than during the French attempt. The completed canal stretched 50 miles from coast to coast. It included 3 main sets of locks at each end and the massive Gatun Lake in the middle. The minimum depth was 41 feet, allowing most ocean-going ships of the time to pass through. The Panama Canal's completion represented a major engineering achievement. Where the French had failed, the Americans succeeded through careful planning and systematic problem-solving. They first controlled the diseases that killed workers, then organized the massive project efficiently, and finally built the canal using practical engineering solutions. The canal immediately became vital for global shipping, providing a safe shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans that changed world trade patterns permanently. The Panama Canal opened for business on August 15, 1914, but its early years of operation faced unexpected challenges. The timing coincided with the start of World War I in Europe, which immediately reduced international shipping traffic. Many commercial ships stayed in home waters due to wartime dangers, while naval vessels focused on military operations rather than using the new canal. This meant the canal's economic impact took several years to materialize fully. Initial operations revealed practical issues needing adjustment. The locks worked as designed, but required fine-tuning of procedures. Canal pilots needed time to develop expertise handling different ship types through the narrow channels. The original plan called for ships to pass through in about 12 hours, but early transits often took longer as crews adapted to the new system. Within a few years, the average transit time improved to about 8 hours as operations became more efficient. Maintenance emerged as a constant challenge. The tropical environment caused rapid wear on equipment. Saltwater corrosion affected metal parts, while humidity damaged electrical systems. The canal workforce transitioned from construction to maintenance roles, constantly repairing and replacing components. Landslides in the Culebra Cut remained a problem, requiring ongoing dredging to keep the channel clear. These operational realities made the canal more expensive to run than initially projected. Traffic through the canal grew steadily after the war ended in 1918. Shipping companies gradually adapted their routes to take advantage of the shorter passage. The canal particularly benefited trade between the U.S. East Coast and Asia, saving ships the long journey around South America. By the 1920s, about 5,000 ships were using the canal annually. This number would continue rising as global trade expanded. The canal's operation became a model of efficiency under U.S. management. A strict schedule ensured smooth traffic flow in both directions. Ships arrived at designated times and moved through the system without unnecessary delays. The canal employed about 4,000 workers during this period, many of whom lived in this canal zone with their families. The zone developed into a small American community with schools, hospitals, and recreational facilities. Relations between the U.S. and Panama showed early signs of strain during this period. Many Panamanians felt excluded from the economic benefits of the canal. The 1903 treaty gave the U.S. control over the canal zone, which became essentially American territory cutting through Panama. Disputes arose over wages for Panamanian workers and the zone's boundaries. These tensions would continue growing over the decades. Technological changes affected canal operations during the 1920s and 1930s. The shift from coal to oil-powered ships reduced the need for coaling stations in the zone. Larger ships began appearing, testing the canal's original size limits. The maximum ship size that could fit through became known as Panamax, setting a standard for shipbuilders worldwide. Some vessels had to be designed specifically to meet these size restrictions. The canal's military importance became clear during this period. U.S. naval ships could move quickly between oceans, strengthening American defense capabilities. The canal zone housed military bases that protected the waterway. This strategic value made the U.S. determined to maintain control, even as calls for Panamanian involvement grew louder. Economic changes in the 1930s affected canal traffic. The Great Depression reduced global trade, leading to fewer ships passing through. At the same time, competition emerged as some shipping lines found alternative routes more economical, despite being longer. These fluctuations showed that the canal's success depended on broader economic conditions beyond local control. By the late 1930s, the canal had settled into a stable operational routine. The initial technical problems had been solved, and traffic flows became predictable. However, new challenges loomed as ships continued growing larger and international tensions rose again in the lead-up to World War II. The canal's first quarter-century of operation proved its value, but also revealed limitations that would need addressing in future years. The stage was set for new developments as world conditions changed and technology advanced. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 changed the importance of the Panama Canal. As global conflict spread, the canal became a key military asset for the United States. The ability to move warships quickly between the Atlantic and Pacific was vital for defense. The U.S. government increased security along the canal, adding troops and anti-aircraft guns. Barbed wire fences appeared around critical areas. Blackout rules were enforced at night to protect against potential air attacks. Shipping traffic through the canal increased during the war years. Military vessels received priority, often causing delays for commercial ships. The canal workforce operated around the clock to keep the waterway open. Despite fears, no direct attacks occurred on the canal during the war. Its safe operation helped the Allied war effort by allowing rapid movement of ships and supplies between theaters of war. After the war ended in 1945, canal operations returned to normal. Commercial shipping traffic grew as global trade recovered. The U.S. maintained a strong military presence at the canal zone, which now included several bases. The zone had become a permanent American community, with schools, stores, and housing for workers and military families. Life in the zone followed American customs, creating a small piece of the U.S. in the middle of Panama. Relations between the U.S. and Panama grew more difficult during this period. Many Panamanians felt their country was not benefiting enough from the canal. The 1903 treaty gave Panama only a small annual payment, while the U.S. controlled the zone and collected all tolls. Protests became more common, with Panamanians arguing the treaty was unfair. In 1947, plans to establish new U.S. military bases outside the canal zone caused large protests, forcing the U.S. to abandon the idea. The 1950s saw rising nationalism in Panama. Students and workers held demonstrations demanding changes to the canal agreement. The most serious incident occurred in 1959 when Panamanians entered the canal zone to plant their national flag. U.S. troops stopped them, leading to violent clashes. These events showed growing frustration with American control of the canal. At the same time, the canal faced operational challenges. Ship sizes continued increasing, with some vessels barely fitting through the locks. Maintenance costs rose as the infrastructure aged. The original locks, now over 40 years old, needed constant repairs. Engineers began studying ways to modernize the canal to handle larger ships, but no major improvements were made during this period. The U.S. government made small changes to address Panamanian concerns. In 1955, a new treaty increased the annual payment to Panama and gave Panamanian workers in the zone better wages. However, the key issue of sovereignty over the canal zone remained unresolved. Panamanian leaders continued pushing for greater control over the waterway running through their country. By the end of the 1950s, it was clear the status quo could not last. The original 1903 treaty had been made when Panama was a newly independent nation with little bargaining power. Now, with decolonization movements growing worldwide and Panama's economy developing, demands for change became stronger. The stage was set for difficult negotiations about the canal's future. The canal itself continued operating efficiently during these years. Traffic steadily increased, and toll revenue grew. The waterway had become essential for global trade, particularly for oil shipments from Alaska and goods moving between the U.S. East Coast and Asia. But political pressures and physical limitations both signaled that changes would be necessary in the coming decades. The question was no longer whether the canal would change, but how and when those changes would happen. During these 2 decades, the Panama Canal remained under firm U.S. control, but the foundations of that control were weakening. The military importance shown during World War II gave way to commercial dominance in peacetime, while political challenges from Panama grew steadily stronger. The next years would see these tensions lead to major changes in the canal's management and ownership. The 1960s marked the start of major changes in the Panama Canal's ownership and operation. Growing political pressure from Panama forced the United States to reconsider its control of the waterway. In 1960, President Dwight Eisenhower took the first step by ordering the Panamanian flag to be flown alongside the American flag in the canal zone. This small symbolic gesture acknowledged Panama's claims over the territory. 4 years later, a more serious conflict erupted. In January 1964, Panamanian students entered the canal zone to raise their flag at a high school. a scuffle broke out with American students, leading to riots that spread across Panama City. The violence lasted 4 days, leaving more than 20 Panamanians and 4 Americans dead. The incident became known as Martyrs' Day in Panama and forced both countries to address the canal issue seriously. Negotiations began in 1965 but progressed slowly. The main sticking point was Panama's demand for full control of the canal, while the U.S. wanted to maintain operational authority. Talks stalled several times as neither side would compromise on these core positions. Meanwhile, the canal continued operating normally, with traffic increasing each year as global trade expanded. A breakthrough came in 1974 when the U.S. agreed to negotiate new treaties that would eventually transfer the canal to Panama. The talks lasted nearly 3 years, facing opposition from American conservatives who believed the U.S. should keep the canal permanently. In Panama, some groups demanded immediate transfer without conditions. The negotiations finally produced results in 1977 when President Jimmy Carter and Panamanian leader Omar Torrijos signed 2 new treaties. The first treaty stated the canal would be transferred to Panama on December 31st, 1999. The second guaranteed the canal's permanent neutrality, allowing all nations to use it peacefully. The U.S. Senate narrowly approved the treaties after heated debate, with many senators concerned about giving up American control. Implementation of the treaties began in 1979. The canal zone ceased to exist as a U.S. territory, with most land returned to Panama. A new agency called the Panama Canal Commission took over canal operations, with joint American-Panamanian management. The transition period aimed to prepare Panama for full control by training local workers and transferring technical knowledge. During these years, the canal faced operational challenges. The waterway's infrastructure was aging, with some components over 60 years old. Maintenance costs rose as engineers worked to keep the original locks functioning. Shipping patterns changed as container ships grew larger, with many now too big for the canal's dimensions. Some business was lost to alternative routes, though the canal remained vital for certain trades. The political changes affected the thousands of Americans living and working in the former canal zone. Many chose to leave as U.S. government jobs were phased out. Schools and military bases began closing, marking the end of the American community that had existed since 1904. Panama took over these facilities, converting some for new uses while others were abandoned. Economic studies during this period examined the canal's future under Panamanian control. Experts predicted the waterway could remain profitable if properly maintained and modernized. However, questions remained about Panama's ability to manage such a complex operation without American expertise. The transition period was designed to address these concerns through training and shared management. By the end of the 1970s, the process of transferring the canal was underway, but far from complete. The next 2 decades would determine whether Panama could successfully take over this engineering marvel that had been under American control for 75 years. The treaties had set the course, but many practical challenges remained before the final handover at the century's end. The Panama Canal operates as a vital pathway for global shipping. It is managed entirely by the Panama Canal Authority, an organization belonging to the government of Panama. Following the completion of the major expansion project in 2016, the canal possesses the capability to accommodate significantly larger ships. These very large ships are categorized under the term Neo-Panamax. Neo-Panamax vessels can transport substantially greater quantities of cargo, including standard shipping containers, bulk commodities like grain, and specialized shipments such as liquefied natural gas, LNG. The original, smaller locks constructed during the initial building phase over a century ago continue to function reliably. They operate alongside the newer, much larger locks that were added during the recent expansion project. This dual system allows the canal to serve a wider variety of vessel sizes and types efficiently. The canal's fundamental purpose remains providing a crucial shortcut. It creates a direct link between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This link saves ships an immense amount of time and distance compared to the alternative route, sailing around the southernmost point of South America, Cape Horn. That southern route is not only much longer, but also poses greater risks due to challenging weather and sea conditions. Statistics indicate that approximately 6% of the world's total cargo ship movements utilize the Panama Canal annually. This represents a significant portion of international trade volume. Each year, the canal facilitates the transit of many thousands of ships. The goods transported through the canal are diverse, encompassing manufactured products packed in shipping containers, automobiles and other vehicles, various fuels including crude oil, refined petroleum products, and liquefied natural gas, agricultural products such as grains and soybeans, and raw materials like coal. Ships registered in or carrying cargo destined for the United States, China, Chile, and Japan are among the most frequent users of the canal route. The operation of the canal generates substantial revenue for the nation of Panama. The fees collected from shipping companies for using the canal constitute a major component of Panama's national income and government budget. The calculation of these transit fees is based primarily on the size of the vessel and the type of cargo it is carrying. For the largest Neo-Panamax ships, particularly container carriers and LNG tankers, the fee for a single transit can reach several $100,000. This significant income stream is vital for Panama's overall economy. It funds not only the ongoing operation and maintenance of the canal itself, but also contributes financially to other national development projects and public services across the country. Ensuring the smooth and reliable operation of the canal involves addressing persistent challenges. A primary concern is the management of water resources. The canal relies heavily on fresh water, primarily sourced from the artificial Lake Gatun, to fill the lock chambers each time a ship is raised or lowered during its transit. Lake Gatun is replenished almost entirely by rainfall within its surrounding watershed. Periods of significantly reduced rainfall, known as droughts, cause the water level in Lake Gatun to decline. When the lake level drops too low, the Canal Authority faces difficult decisions. It may become necessary to impose restrictions on the total number of ships permitted to transit each day. Alternatively, or additionally, the authority might enforce draft restrictions, limiting how deeply laden ships can be, how much cargo they can carry, to prevent them from running aground in the shallower water. These restrictions inevitably cause delays in shipping schedules and increase operational costs for shipping lines. Consequently, finding effective methods to reduce water consumption per lockage cycle and to enhance water storage capacity is a continuous operational priority. The newer locks incorporate a water-saving basin system designed to reuse a portion of the water from each lockage, which helps mitigate this challenge, but does not eliminate it. Maintaining the required depth and width of the navigation channels is another constant operational task. Natural processes cause soil, silt, and sediment to erode from the land surrounding the canal and gradually accumulate within the channels. To counteract this, large specialized vessels called dredgers work regularly to remove this accumulated material. This dredging is essential to ensure the channels remain deep enough and wide enough for the safe passage of large vessels, especially the deep-draft Neo-Panamax ships. Furthermore, the mechanical components of the lock gates, the valves controlling water flow, the locomotives, mules that guide ships, and the associated infrastructure all require ongoing inspection, routine maintenance, and periodic repairs to prevent malfunctions and ensure continuous, safe operation. This maintenance work is a fundamental, non-stop aspect of canal management. Competition from alternative global shipping routes presents an external challenge. Other major maritime passages exist. The Suez Canal in Egypt offers a primary route connecting Asia and Europe. Economic factors, such as fluctuations in fuel prices, toll costs at different canals, and specific world events impacting specific regions, influence shipping companies' decisions. Sometimes, for certain voyages, particularly those originating in Asia and heading to Europe or the U.S. East Coast, the Suez Canal route might offer a shorter distance, lower overall cost, or faster transit time compared to the Panama route. Shifts in global trade patterns, such as changes in manufacturing locations or consumer demand centers, also affect the volume and direction of cargo flows potentially using the Panama Canal. Therefore, the Canal Authority must consistently focus on maintaining high levels of operational efficiency, reliability, and competitive pricing to retain its existing users and attract new shipping traffic. Proposals for constructing entirely new canals, such as one across Nicaragua, have surfaced periodically, but none have progressed beyond the planning stage due to immense financial, environmental, and technical hurdles. Additionally, the potential for shorter Arctic shipping routes, facilitated by reduced sea ice due to climate change, exists. However, the viability, safety, and year-round reliability of these northern routes remain highly uncertain and are unlikely to challenge the Panama Canal significantly in the near or medium term. Weather patterns and the broader issue of climate change introduce further complexity and risk. Changes in climate may result in more frequent or severe periods of drought within the canal's watershed, directly threatening the water supply in Lake Gatun. Conversely, increased intensity of storms or heavy rainfall events can cause flooding, landslides into the channels, or necessitate temporary closures for safety. Managing the water resources of Lake Gatun involves a delicate balance. The lake must provide sufficient water for the canal's lock operations, while also serving as a crucial source of drinking water and water for agriculture for the population living in the nearby regions. Protecting the forests and natural vegetation within the canal's watershed is critically important. These forests help regulate the flow of rainwater, reduce soil erosion that leads to sedimentation in the lake and channels, and contribute to maintaining water quality. The Canal Authority engages in watershed management programs to support this environmental protection. Looking towards the future, the Panama Canal Authority is committed to sustained investment in the waterway. This involves allocating significant financial resources for the upkeep, repair, and modernization of the existing infrastructure. Both the original locks and the newer expansion locks, as well as the channels and support facilities. Potential future projects could explore further technological or operational improvements aimed at enhancing water efficiency, increasing transit capacity where feasible, or improving resilience against climate impacts. The overarching objective is to ensure the Panama Canal remains a competitive, reliable, and indispensable link within the global maritime transportation network for decades to come. The canal is deeply intertwined with Panama's national identity and economic well-being. It continues to function as a vital connection point in international trade, requiring continuous adaptation to accommodate evolving ship sizes, changing global trade routes, and the escalating challenges presented by a changing environment. Its successful operation demands relentless attention to management, maintenance, and forward-looking planning. The man pulled into the gravel parking lot just off Route 102, his tires crunching on the mix of small stones and fallen leaves. The lot was nearly empty this late in the season, just his pickup truck and a beat-up Honda Civic with Vermont plates. He stepped out into that crisp New England air, the kind that smells like damp earth and wood smoke this time of year, and zipped up his fleece jacket against the October chill. The trailhead wasn't much to look at, just a simple wooden kiosk with a faded map under plexiglass and a rusted metal donation box bolted to the side. A hand-painted sign read, "Mount Monadnock State Forest," in peeling white letters. He'd been here before, years ago, back when his knees didn't creak like these old floorboards. The parking fee was now $5, up from $3 last time. So he fed a 5 into the slot, not bothering with the envelope system they'd implemented. The path started off easy, wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, covered in that particular New England mix of pine needles and oak leaves. Sugar maples lined the trail, their famous fiery red leaves just past peak, but still putting on a decent show. Every so often, a yellow birch interrupted the lineup, its papery bark peeling in curls. The ground was littered with acorns from the white oaks, each one making a satisfying crunch when stepped on. About a quarter-mile in, the trail split, left toward the summit, 4.2 miles, the sign said, or right around the easier pond loop. He went right, not feeling particularly ambitious today. The path narrowed and began following an old stone wall, the kind you see everywhere in New England, built by farmers 2 centuries ago and now just part of the scenery. Lichen covered most of the granite stones, with occasional patches of moss filling the gaps where mortar might have been. The air smelled different here, less like leaves and more like wet rocks and pine. White pines towered overhead, their long needles creating a soft carpet on the forest floor. A red squirrel chattered angrily from one of the branches before darting up the trunk and disappearing. The trail dipped slightly as it approached the pond. Not really a pond, more of a large vernal pool that stuck around most of the year. The water was dark brown from all the tannins, with a few yellowed lily pads floating near the edges. A lone duck, probably a mallard, paddled slowly across the far side, ripples spreading behind it. He sat on one of the flat rocks near the water's edge, the kind of spot that would be crowded with families in summer, but was deserted now. The rock was cold through his jeans. A few late-season mosquitoes buzzed around, but weren't really biting. From somewhere in the distance came the call of a blue jay, that familiar harsh screech that always sounds vaguely annoyed. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves still clinging to the beeches. Their pale yellow leaves always hung on longer than the maples. After a while, he didn't check his watch. He got up and brushed the pine needles from his pants. The walk back was the same as the walk in, just in reverse. Same stones in the wall, same acorns underfoot, same gradual incline that made his calves notice they were working. Back at the parking lot, his truck was now the only vehicle. He tossed his half-full water bottle onto the passenger seat and started the engine, the radio automatically picking up the local NPR station talking about apple picking season. As he pulled onto Route 102, heading toward Keene, he glanced in the rear view at the trailhead sign shrinking behind him. It had been exactly what he expected. A quiet walk in the woods. Nothing more, nothing less. Just another autumn afternoon in southern New Hampshire. The man pulled off Route 9 onto the dirt road leading to the trailhead, his tires kicking up small stones that pinged against the undercarriage. The October sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the mixed hardwood forest typical of western Massachusetts. A wooden sign with peeling green paint marked the entrance to October Mountain State Forest in uneven block letters, the state's largest tract of wild land that nobody ever seemed to visit. He parked in the empty lot beside the old iron gate that hadn't been closed in decades, its hinges rusted solid. The air smelled of decaying leaves and wood smoke from some distant chimney. A faded trail map under plexiglass showed the various paths winding through the 16,000-acre forest. But he already knew where he was going. The easy loop around Finnerty Pond, about 3 miles with minimal elevation gain. Perfect for an afternoon when he didn't feel like working too hard. The trail began as most do in New England, with a gentle incline through a tunnel of maple and oak trees. Their fallen leaves created a crunchy carpet underfoot, the reds and oranges now fading to brown. Every so often, a white pine would interrupt the deciduous monotony, its long needles forming a soft mat that muted his footsteps. The occasional yellow birch stood out with its peeling, paper-like bark that locals sometimes used to start campfires. About half a mile in, the path crossed a small wooden bridge over a sluggish stream. The planks creaked under his weight, and he paused to look at the dark water below, stained tea-brown from tannins. A few last-of-season ferns clung to the muddy banks, their fronds curling at the edges. Somewhere upstream, a branch snapped, probably a deer, though he didn't see it. The forest here had that quiet stillness unique to weekdays in October, when the leaf peepers had gone home and the hunters hadn't yet arrived in force. The trail curved gently westward, following what might have been an old logging road generations ago. Stone walls peeked through the undergrowth in places, remnants of farms long abandoned to the forest, A rusted piece of machinery, maybe part of a plow, lay half buried in the leaves near one such wall, its purpose no longer obvious. He stepped over a fallen birch trunk covered in shelf fungus, the wood spongy with rot. As the path neared Finnerty Pond, the trees thinned and the air took on the damp, mineral smell of standing water. The pond itself was small and still, its surface reflecting the gray sky like polished slate. A few dead trees stood sentinel in the shallow water, their bleached branches reaching skyward. At the far end, a beaver lodge rose like a messy pile of sticks, though there was no sign of current activity. He sat on a flat rock near the water's edge, the same one he'd used as a lunch spot for years, and took a sip from his water bottle. The only sounds were the occasional plop of a fish rising and the distant caw of a crow. After 15 minutes of not much happening, he got up and continued around the pond. The trail grew muddier here, with boot prints from earlier hikers preserved in the clay-like soil. A boardwalk spanned the wettest section, its planks worn smooth by countless footsteps. Near the halfway point, a spur trail led to an overlook with a view of the Berkshires rolling westward, their autumn colors muted in the afternoon haze. He skipped it today. The view wouldn't have changed since last time. The return leg passed through a stand of hemlocks that blocked most of the sunlight, creating a sudden chill. Their dense canopy meant little grew beneath them, just some moss and the occasional mushroom pushing through the needle carpet. A woodpecker hammered somewhere in the distance, the sound echoing through the trees. The trail joined an old woods road for the final stretch back, wide enough for two to walk abreast if there'd been anyone else around. Back at the parking lot, his car sat alone just as he'd left it. A few more leaves had fallen on the windshield during his walk. He brushed them off before getting in, the vinyl seats cold through his jeans. The engine turned over on the first try, and as he pulled back onto Route 9, the radio automatically tuned to the local station playing classic rock. Another uneventful walk in the woods, exactly as he'd expected. Just another Tuesday afternoon in the Berkshires. The man turned his pickup into the empty parking area just past the Welcome to Vermont sign on Route 100. The gravel crunching under his tires in that particular way it does in late October. A wooden sign with peeling green paint read Moss Glen Falls Trailhead in hand-carved letters, though the falls themselves were barely more than a steep cascade by New England standards. He killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the ticking sound of the cooling truck, mixed with the occasional call of a nuthatch from the surrounding maples. The air smelled different here than in Massachusetts. Crisper somehow, with more evergreen in the mix from all the balsam firs that started appearing as soon as you crossed the state line. He grabbed his worn flannel jacket from the back seat and stepped out into the chill, his boots sinking slightly into the damp ground near the trailhead register. The metal box contained a damp notebook where hikers were supposed to sign in, though most pages just had a few scribbled names from peak foliage weekends. He didn't bother adding his. The trail started off wide and well-packed, following an old logging road that gradually narrowed as maples and birches closed in from both sides. Their leaves formed a patchy canopy overhead, letting through shafts of sunlight that illuminated the occasional red trillium berry still clinging to its stalk. The forest floor was a mess of fallen branches and decomposing leaves, with the occasional granite boulder poking through, the kind of rocks that made Vermont's soil so notoriously difficult to farm. About a quarter-mile in, the sound of running water grew louder. The trail split at a wooden post, with arrows pointing left toward the fall's overlook and right toward the gorge trail. He went left, the path now climbing steadily over tree roots and small stones slick with spray from the falls. The air grew damper, carrying that mineral smell of moving water over rock. A few scraggly hemlocks clung to the steep banks, their roots exposed where erosion had undercut the soil. Moss Glen Falls wasn't exactly Niagara, just a series of steep drops totaling maybe 100 feet, the water dividing around a massive glacial erratic at the top before reuniting in the pool below. The viewing area consisted of a few flat rocks and a wooden rail that had seen better days. He sat on one of the drier rocks and watched the water for a while, noting how the afternoon light made the spray glow when it caught the sun just right. A couple of late-season monarch butterflies fluttered near some milkweed pods that hadn't yet burst open, their orange wings looking faded compared to the vibrant maples behind them. After what felt like 20 minutes, he never wore a watch. He retraced his steps to the fork and took the gorge trail downward. This path was rougher, with more exposed roots and sections where runoff had carved deep grooves in the dirt. The sound of the falls faded, replaced by the quieter trickle of smaller streams feeding into the main cascade. A wooden bridge crossed one such stream, its planks worn smooth from years of boot traffic. He paused midway to look at the water below, so clear he could see every pebble on the bottom despite the depth. The gorge walls grew steeper as the trail descended, the rock faces covered in moss and the occasional stubborn fern clinging to cracks. A pileated woodpecker's call echoed from somewhere upstream, that distinctive jungle movie sound that always seemed out of place in New England woods. The trail eventually leveled out near the base of the gorge, where the stream widened into a shallow pool before continuing downhill. A few yellowed skunk cabbage leaves marked what would be a wetland in spring, their foul smell long gone with the season. The loop brought him back to the main trail near the parking area, completing maybe 2 miles total at most. His truck was still the only vehicle there, though someone had left a Dunkin' Donuts cup on the picnic table near the trailhead. He tossed it in the bed of his truck to throw out later. Vermont had a 5-cent bottle deposit after all. The drive back south on Route 100 passed through classic Vermont scenery. Red barns with peeling paint, fields full of round hay bales wrapped in white plastic, the occasional covered bridge looking exactly like it did on the state quarter. He stopped in Rochester for gas and a coffee, the local AM station playing a high school football score update. The coffee tasted like it had been sitting there since morning, which it probably had. Back on the road, with the Green Mountains receding in his rearview mirror, he thought about how little had changed since his last visit. Same falls, same trails, same quiet emptiness that made Vermont feel both timeless and slightly forgotten. The trees might lose their leaves and the snow might come, but Moss Glen would keep flowing just the same, with or without anyone there to notice. He merged onto I-91 South as the sun dipped behind the hills, the truck's heater finally kicking in against the evening chill. Another uneventful afternoon in Vermont. Exactly as expected. The man pulled into the half-empty parking lot at Acadia National Park's Jordan Pond entrance just after noon, his tires kicking up small stones from the dirt overflow area. A crisp Maine breeze carried that distinctive coastal pine scent, mixed with something briny from the distant ocean. The late October sun hung pale in the sky, doing little to warm the air that smelled of damp moss and decomposing leaves. He zipped his fleece higher as he stepped out, glancing at the familiar brown park sign with peeling gold letters that listed trail distances and regulations nobody ever read. The path began, as most do in Acadia, wide and gravel-covered, built to handle summer crowds that had long since disappeared. A few stubborn oak leaves clung to branches overhead, their brown edges curling in the salt air, while the blueberry bushes lining the trail had already turned that deep burgundy unique to Maine's coastal autumns. Underfoot, the gravel gave way to the park's signature granite gravel, crushed local stone that sparkled slightly in the weak sunlight. A chipmunk darted across the path, disappearing into a stone wall that had stood since the Civilian Conservation Corps boys built it back in the 1930s. Jordan Pond lay still and dark ahead, its surface rippling slightly from the breeze coming off the nearby ocean. To the left, the trail passed the famous Jordan Pond House, with its empty green lawn chairs still arranged on the sloping lawn. The restaurant closed for the season after the last pop-over tourists had departed weeks earlier. The man kept walking, his boots making hollow sounds on the wooden boardwalk sections that crossed the boggiest areas. The planks, worn smooth by millions of summer sandals, now felt slightly slick with morning dew that never quite burned off this time of year. The loop trail followed the pond's shoreline closely, passing through stands of white pine and pitch pine that blocked most of what little sunlight there was. Their needles formed a dense carpet that muffled footsteps, occasionally giving way to exposed granite ledges where hikers had worn away the thin soil over decades. At the northern end of the pond, the trail climbed slightly over a series of stone steps placed there by park maintenance crews, each one worn concave in the middle from years of use. A weathered sign pointed toward the Bubbles, those two rounded mountains that appeared on every Acadia postcard. But he stayed on the level path, not feeling inclined to climb today. The far side of the pond felt more isolated, the trail narrowing to a single track in places where tree roots created natural steps. A few late-season mushrooms pushed through the pine duff, red-capped ones that might have been poisonous, and the occasional cluster of honey mushrooms that local foragers would have picked months ago. The water here was shallower, and through the clear Maine water, he could see the pond's famous singing sands. Grains of granite so perfectly rounded, they supposedly made musical sounds when walked on. Not that anyone would be wading in October. About halfway around, a side trail led to an overlook with a view of the pond and the distant Cranberry Islands. The wooden bench there had initials carved into its arms. JT plus MK09. The letters weathered, but still legible after 14 Maine winters. He sat for a while, watching a lone loon dive near the opposite shore, its haunting call echoing across the water in a way that always sounded lonely to him. The wind picked up, carrying the faint diesel smell of a lobster boat working the sound somewhere out of sight. The return leg passed through a section of stunted spruce trees, twisted into strange shapes by coastal winds, their branches all leaning landward as if trying to escape the ocean. A few red squirrels chattered warnings as he passed, their nests of shredded bark visible in the crooks of larger trees. The trail joined an old carriage road near the end, its crushed stone surface still perfectly smooth from decades of Rockefeller money and National Park Service maintenance. A horse-drawn carriage would pass here daily in season, but today the only signs of life were fresh deer tracks in the damp gravel. Back at the parking lot, a few more cars had arrived. Locals, probably, judging by the main plates and lack of roof racks for kayaks. He tossed his half-empty water bottle into the truck's footwell and started the engine. The local NPR affiliate crackling to life with a report on the lobster catch being down this season. As he pulled out onto the Park Loop Road, the afternoon light turned the Cadillac mountain granite a warm, pinkish gray, same as it had every afternoon for millennia. Another quiet walk around Jordan Pond, unchanged since his last visit, and likely to remain so until next spring's tourists returned. He passed through the stone gateposts at the park exit, the ocean now visible between the trees to his right, its surface choppy and dark blue under the October sky. Just another day in coastal Maine, where even the most famous trails felt empty once summer left and the real New England weather set in. "Hey there." The man pulled his truck into the dirt turnout along the Cantamagos Highway, the tires crunching over pine cones and gravel. This stretch of Route 112 through New Hampshire's White Mountains was practically empty now that foliage season had passed. Just a few locals and the occasional trucker using it as a shortcut. He stepped out into air that smelled distinctly of balsam fir and wet granite, that classic White Mountain scent that never seemed to change no matter the decade. The trailhead wasn't much to look at, just a small wooden sign with Greeley Ponds Trail carved into it. The letters faded from years of harsh mountain weather. The parking area had that uneven, frost-heaved pavement common to all Forest Service lots in the region, with weeds growing through every crack. He dropped $5 in the Iron Ranger fee tube, exact change only, the sign reminded hikers, and started down the path, his boots immediately hitting that particular New Hampshire mix of pine needles and granite gravel. The first mile followed an old logging road, wide enough for two but mostly grown over with young spruce and the occasional paper birch. The birches stood out white against the evergreen backdrop, their yellow leaves mostly on the ground now, forming a soggy carpet that squished underfoot in the damp spots. Every so often he'd pass a glacial erratic, those massive boulders the Ice Age glaciers had dropped randomly, some as big as SUVs, all covered in lichen in shades of green and gray. The trail began a gradual climb after crossing a wooden bridge over a stream that was more rock than water this time of year. The bridge's planks were worn smooth from decades of boots, their surface slightly slippery from morning dew. Below, the water ran clear over granite worn smooth by centuries of flow, forming those shallow pools New Englanders called swimming holes, even though nobody would swim in them after Labor Day. A few last-of-season ferns clung to the banks, their fronds turning brown at the edges. About 2 miles in, the forest changed noticeably as the trail entered an area that had burned decades earlier. The regrowth was all skinny spruce and pin cherry trees, their trunks blackened at the base from some long-ago forest fire. The understory opened up here, allowing views of distant peaks like Mount Osceola and East Pond Mountain, not the tallest in the Whites, but steep enough to make your calves burn if you tried climbing them. A pileated woodpecker's call echoed through the burned area, that prehistoric-sounding laugh that always seemed too loud for the surrounding quiet. The first pond appeared suddenly after a short climb, its dark water reflecting the surrounding evergreens perfectly. Greeley Ponds were really just two large mountain tarns connected by a shallow stream, the kind of place that would be crowded with hikers in July, but was deserted now. He sat on a flat rock near the water's edge, the granite cold even through his pants. The only sounds were the occasional plop of a fish rising and the distant rush of wind through the higher peaks. A few late-season mosquitoes hovered, but didn't bite. It was too cold for them now, thankfully. After eating the peanut butter sandwich he'd brought, he continued around the larger pond's shoreline. The trail grew rougher here, with more roots and rocks to navigate. In places, wooden bog bridges crossed the wettest sections, their surfaces worn smooth and slightly mossy. A spur path led to an overlook with a view of the smaller pond below, its surface ruffled by the same breeze that made the surrounding spruce trees sway slightly. The overlook's wooden rail was carved with decades of initials and dates, the oldest still legible being RD 1972. The return trip followed the same path back, which was fine by him. He'd never been one for loop hikes anyway. The burned area looked different in afternoon light, the shadows longer now that the sun was dipping toward the western peaks. Back at the stream crossing, he paused to watch the water for a while, noting how it swirled around certain rocks in patterns that probably hadn't changed in centuries. A red squirrel chattered angrily from a nearby spruce, upset at the human intrusion. The parking lot was still nearly empty when he returned. Just one other car now, an old Subaru with New Hampshire plates, and a "This car climbed Mount Washington" sticker on the bumper. He tossed his pack in the truck bed and sat for a moment with the door open, listening to the distant sound of a chainsaw from somewhere down the valley. The Kancamagus stretched out before him, its empty pavement winding through the mountains exactly as it had when he'd first driven it 20 years earlier. Some things in the Whites never changed, and he figured that was probably for the best. The engine turned over with that familiar rumble, and as he pulled back onto the highway, the local AM station crackled to life with a weather report warning of frost overnight. Just another quiet day in the White Mountains, where the trails stayed the same, and the only real excitement was whether you'd need a heavier jacket tomorrow. The man pulled off Route 302 into the nearly empty Crawford Notch State Park lot, his tires rolling over the familiar mix of gravel and decomposing leaves that seemed to cover every parking area in northern New Hampshire. The air smelled different here in the Notch, colder and sharper, with that distinct alpine edge you only get when surrounded by 4,000-foot peaks on all sides. He grabbed his worn flannel jacket from behind the seat, the one with the torn pocket he kept meaning to sew, and stepped out into air so still he could hear a single yellow birch leaf skitter across the pavement. The trailhead wasn't much to look at. Just a simple wooden sign with Ripley Falls burned into the wood in uneven letters. The arrow pointing toward what looked like an ordinary woods road. The parking fee was $4, exact change only. So he dropped the wrinkled bills into the iron pipe bolted to the kiosk. The register notebook inside the metal box showed only 3 other hikers this week, their names barely legible in smudged pencil. He didn't bother signing in. The path started as most do in the Whites, wide and gravel-covered at first, following what had clearly been an old logging road decades earlier. The surrounding forest was that particular White Mountain mix of beech, yellow birch, and spruce, their branches still dripping from yesterday's rain. Every so often, a massive glacial erratic would appear beside the trail, some as big as pickup trucks, all covered in that fuzzy green lichen that grows on everything in damp New England. The ground was littered with beech nuts, their spiky outer casings crunching underfoot like some natural version of bubble wrap. After about half a mile of gentle incline, the trail narrowed and began following a small stream uphill. The sound of running water grew louder as the path became rockier, with occasional stone steps placed there by trail crews long ago. The steps were worn smooth in the centers, their edges rounded by decades of boot traffic and winter freeze-thaw cycles. A wooden bridge crossed the stream at one point, its planks slightly springy underfoot, the railings polished shiny by countless hands gripping them over the years. The falls appeared suddenly around a bend in the trail, not some towering cascade, but a steep, sliding drop of about 100 feet over smooth granite. The water fanned out in thin sheets over the rock, creating that distinctive veil look that gave Ripley Falls its reputation as one of the prettier waterfalls in the Whites. The spray zone was marked by a distinct change in vegetation. Suddenly there were more ferns and mosses, their greens impossibly vibrant against the gray rock. A single gnarled spruce clung to a crack in the cliff face, its roots exposed where centuries of water had eroded the soil beneath it. He sat on one of the flat rocks near the base of the falls, the stone cold even through his pants. The mist from the falling water kept the air chilly, carrying that mineral smell unique to mountain streams. A few late-season goldenrod plants clung to life in sheltered cracks, their yellow flowers looking oddly bright against all the gray and green. Somewhere upstream, a branch snapped, probably a deer, though he didn't bother looking up to check. After a while, he never wore a watch. He started back down the trail. The return hike was always quicker, the slight downhill grade making his knees remember they weren't as young as they used to be. The same glacial erratics passed by in reverse order, the same beech nuts crunched underfoot. Near the trailhead, he passed an older couple heading up, the first people he'd seen all day. They nodded silently, the standard White Mountain greeting between hikers, and continued on their way without speaking. Back at the parking lot, his truck was still the only vehicle there. He tossed his jacket onto the passenger seat and started the engine. The local AM station crackling to life with a weather report about frost warnings for the higher elevations. As he pulled back onto Route 302, the afternoon sun lit up the cliffs of Crawford Notch in that particular way it only does in late October, all golden light and long shadows. The Willie House Historic Site passed by on the right, its empty parking lot and closed visitor center looking abandoned until next tourist season. Another few miles down the road, the iconic Mount Washington Hotel appeared in the distance, its white facade and red roofs looking exactly as they had for a century, framed by the changing leaves of the surrounding hardwoods. He turned up the heat as the notch's microclimate made the temperature drop noticeably, his breath briefly fogging the windshield until the defroster caught up. The truck's engine hummed steadily as the highway began its gradual descent toward Bartlett and the Mount Washington Valley beyond. Another quiet hike completed, another waterfall checked off the mental list, another afternoon in the Whites where nothing much happened, and that was exactly how he liked it. The mountains would still be there next week, next month, next year, unchanged, except for the seasons cycling through their endless rotations. And he'd be back too, probably, to walk another trail and see another stream, because that's just what people did in these parts when they needed to remember how little things really changed in the grand scheme of things. The man turned around and started walking back the same way he came, his boots scuffing against the worn dirt path that countless hikers had trodden before him. The trail was just as quiet as before, with only the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot breaking the silence. The air still carried that familiar New England autumn smell, a mix of pine resin, damp earth, and something faintly sweet from the decaying maple leaves. The trees here were mostly sugar maples and red oaks, their leaves showing off those classic New England colors: bright red, deep orange, and golden yellow, with some already turned brown and papery, littering the ground in uneven patches. A few white pines stood like sentinels among the deciduous trees, their needles staying stubbornly green throughout the seasons. Every now and then, a yellow birch would appear among them, its distinctive peeling bark curling in thin, papery strips that fluttered slightly in the occasional breeze. He passed the same old glacial erratic he'd noticed earlier, a massive granite boulder about the size of a pickup truck, covered in patches of moss and lichen. It was one of those rocks that glaciers had dragged down from Canada during the last ice age and then abandoned when they melted, now serving as a permanent fixture in the New England woods. The surface was pitted and weathered, with shallow depressions that sometimes held rainwater. A little farther down the trail, there was a small wooden sign nailed to a mature oak tree, the kind put up by the local Appalachian Mountain Club chapter, with the words, "Appalachian Trail, 50 miles," burned into the wood in uneven letters. Not that he was planning to walk that far today. He just wanted to get back to his car before the early New England dusk settled in. The sign had faded to a silvery gray over the years, its edges worn smooth by weather and occasional passing hands. Someone had carved their initials into it at some point. JR98. But time had made the letters shallow and barely legible. The path was easy enough to follow, packed hard by generations of boots and maintained by volunteers from the local Trails Association. Every now and then, a gray squirrel would dart across the trail, its claws scratching against bark as it raced up a nearby tree. The wind picked up slightly, making the bare upper branches of younger trees rub together with a creaking sound. Somewhere in the distance, probably near that small wetland area marked on the trail map, A blue jay let out its harsh, scolding call, the sound carrying clearly through the crisp autumn air before the forest returned to its usual quiet. A few late-season crickets chirped half-heartedly in the underbrush, where sunlight still reached the forest floor, their rhythm slow and uneven, as if they couldn't quite decide whether it was still summer or already fall. He passed all the familiar landmarks, the young birch tree that grew at an odd angle after some long-ago storm, the patch of interrupted ferns that had turned a sickly yellow before other plants, the massive granite ledge that local kids probably used as a climbing spot in summer. Nothing remarkable, just the usual assortment of natural features you'd find in any Massachusetts woodland. The trail made its lazy curve to the left, following what had once been a deer path or maybe an old logging road, gradually leading him back toward the small parking area near the historic covered bridge. The bridge was one of those classic New England tourist spots, the kind that showed up on fall foliage calendars and local history brochures. Built in 1887, according to the faded plaque on its side, the red paint was peeling in places where moisture had gotten underneath, and the wooden beams inside smelled like generations of damp wool and tobacco smoke. Not that he paid much attention to it. He'd seen it dozens of times before, and right now he was more concerned with getting home before dark. The light was definitely fading now, the sky shifting from pale blue to that particular flat gray that comes before twilight in autumn. The temperature dropped noticeably as the sun dipped lower, and he zipped up his fleece jacket all the way, shoving his hands in his pockets. His footsteps sounded heavier now on the packed earth, the rhythm steady and monotonous. The forest scenery didn't change much. Same mix of trees, same carpet of leaves, same quiet atmosphere. A few more fallen branches lay across the path than there had been on his way in, probably brought down by recent winds. But they were easy enough to step over. Somewhere off to the right, probably in that stand of dead hemlocks, a pileated woodpecker hammered at a trunk, the sound echoing through the woods like someone knocking on hollow wood. After about 30 seconds of intermittent drilling, it stopped, leaving only the occasional whisper of leaves moving in the breeze. Eventually, the trail began its final gentle descent, and he could see the split-rail fence that marked the boundary of the state forest land. The fence had that weathered gray look that all untreated New England wood eventually gets. The posts leaning slightly where frost heaves had shifted the ground over winters past. 20 more paces, and he emerged from the tree line into the small gravel parking area. His car, an old Subaru Outback with a dented rear bumper from that time he slid into a snowbank last winter, sat alone in the lot, its dark green paint nearly blending in with the surrounding pines. The gravel crunched loudly under his boots as he crossed the empty lot, the sound somehow louder than anything he'd heard in the woods. He fished the keys from his pocket, the metal jingling against the worn leather keychain he'd gotten at a gas station years ago. The car door opened with its usual creak, the interior smelling faintly of old coffee and wet dog. Nothing had happened on his walk. Nothing ever did. And that was perfectly fine with him. He turned the key, the engine rumbling to life, and pulled out of the lot, leaving the forest exactly as he'd found it. Quiet, unchanged, and patiently waiting for the next hiker to come along. "Hey there." The man pulled into the deserted parking area off Route 113 near Evans Notch, the tires of his pickup crunching over a thick layer of beech nuts that had fallen from the surrounding trees. This stretch along the Maine New Hampshire border was always quiet after Columbus Day, when the leaf peepers had all gone home and the ski crowds hadn't yet arrived. He stepped out into air that smelled distinctly different from the other notches. Less alpine, more like damp leaves and the faintest hint of wood smoke from some distant hunting camp. The trailhead kiosk had seen better days, its plexiglass cover scratched and fogged with age, the map underneath barely legible. A metal sign announced this as the Brickett Place Trailhead in faded green letters, with smaller print noting it was part of the White Mountain National Forest. The old farmhouse that gave the area its name stood off to the side, its white paint peeling. The Historical Society plaque on the front nearly unreadable from years of weathering. He dropped $3 in the honor system fee tube, exact change only, though nobody would likely check this late in the season. The path started as an old woods road, wide enough for a tractor, but now mostly grown in with young maples and the occasional striped maple, their distinctive vertical bark patterns standing out in the afternoon light. The ground was carpeted with fallen beech leaves, their copper color fading to brown, the dry ones crunching underfoot, while the damp ones just compressed silently. Every so often, a massive glacial erratic appeared beside the trail, some as big as small houses, all covered in that fuzzy green lichen that seems to grow on every stationary surface in northern New England. After about a mile, the trail began following Cold Brook, the sound of running water growing louder as the path narrowed and became rockier. The brook itself was low this time of year, revealing shelves of granite that would be underwater in spring, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of flowing water. A few stubborn ferns still clung to life in sheltered cracks, their fronds turning yellow at the edges. The wooden bridge across the brook's widest point creaked under his weight, its planks worn smooth by decades of boots, and its railings polished shiny from countless hands. The trail climbed gradually through a stand of hemlocks that blocked most of the sunlight, creating a sudden temperature drop. Their needles formed a dense carpet that muffled all sound, except the occasional chatter of a red squirrel. A spur path led to an overlook with a view of the Bald Faces, those distinctive bare-topped mountains that were popular with hikers in summer but deserted now. He skipped the detour today. The view would be the same as last time, just with fewer leaves on the trees. The main trail continued along the brook before opening up into what had clearly been pasture land a century earlier. The old stone walls were still visible beneath the young forest growth, their lines straighter than anything nature would create. A few apple trees stood gnarled and untended near one such wall, their small, bitter fruit long since fallen and mostly eaten by deer. The path grew muddier here where springs surfaced, the wooden bog bridges slick with algae and slightly springy underfoot. At the turnaround point, a small waterfall that was more of a steep cascade, really. He sat on one of the flat rocks and ate the peanut butter sandwich he'd brought. The water made a constant white noise as it tumbled over the granite ledges, the kind of sound that eventually fades into the background until you notice it again. A few late-season mosquitoes hovered but didn't land. It was too cold for them now. The rock was cold through his pants, but he stayed a while anyway, watching the water patterns that never repeated exactly the same way twice. The hike back was the same in reverse, just slightly downhill. The same glacial erratics passed by in opposite order. The same stone walls. The same section of trail where his boots sank slightly into the damp earth. Near the trailhead, he passed a lone hiker heading in. The first person he'd seen all day. They exchanged nods, the standard greeting in these parts, and continued on their separate ways without speaking. Back at the parking lot, his truck was still the only vehicle there. He tossed his pack in the bed and sat for a moment with the door open, listening to the distant sound of a woodpecker hammering somewhere up the valley. The late afternoon light slanted through the beech trees, their smooth gray trunks standing in sharp contrast to the darker hemlocks behind them. As he started the engine, the local AM station came to life with a weather report warning of possible snow flurries above 3,000 feet overnight. He turned onto Route 113, passing the empty campgrounds and shuttered ranger station that marked this as the true off-season in Evans Notch. Another quiet hike completed, another trail walked without incident or excitement, just the way he preferred it. The mountains would still be here next week, next month, next year, same trails, same rocks, same brooks running endlessly downhill. And he'd probably be back too, when the need for quiet and routine outweighed the appeal of staying home. Because that's just what people did in these parts. Year after year, season after season,